The air in the hidden alchemical laboratory beneath the ruins of what had once been Alexandria's greatest temple was thick, warm, and heavy with the scent of burning myrrh and something else. Something indefinable, like the faint echo of a fire that burns without consuming, a flame that transforms rather than destroys. A single ray of sunlight filtered through a precisely angled crystal embedded in the ceiling, illuminated a golden tablet suspended by silver chains above a circular altar of obsidian. Upon the tablet's surface, etched in symbols that merged Egyptian hieroglyphs with Greek letters and patterns that seemed to shift in the light, was a diagram showing a serpentine dragon coiled around a radiant point of light, labeled in ancient Greek as the monad, the one, the source from which all emanates and to which all returns. Around the dragon's ascending spiral were inscribed the words, "She who masters the dragon's fire returns to the monad. She who unites the below with the above becomes the queen of transformation." Before this altar, a lone figure stood, robed in deep crimson, their hands outstretched towards the tablet, their voice barely above a whisper as they recited words in a language older than Greek or Latin or Hebrew, words that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with power. From the depths of the chamber, from the very stone and metal and elements themselves, a response began to build, not sound, but presence. As if the monad itself, that unknowable unity from which all multiplicity springs, was drawing near, called by the ritual, by the intention, by the readiness of one who sought to walk the path that the dragon queens had once walked. What if the ancient Hermetic path to divine union, the return to the monad, the one beyond all duality, was not an abstract philosophical concept, but a practical alchemical process taught and guarded by an order of women known as the Dragon Queens? Priestesses who had mastered the serpent fire within, who understood that the dragon was not symbol, but reality, that its fire was the transformative force that could transmute the lead of mortal consciousness into the gold of divine awareness. And what if this knowledge was so carefully hidden that even most Hermeticists never learned that the path they studied had been walked before them by women whose names were erased, but whose wisdom remained encoded in every alchemical text that spoke of the great work? What timeless mystery did this golden tablet encode, and what profound revelation awaited the one who dared to invoke the monad's fire, to walk the path of the dragon queens, to perceive the delicate threads connecting the ancient mysteries of Egypt, the Hermetic philosophy of transformation, and the sacred feminine power that had been deliberately obscured? My name is Lyra, and the call to something beyond had been a persistent flame burning in the core of my being since the moment I first encountered the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus and sensed beneath its cryptic words about "as above so below," a deeper mystery, a practical instruction for a transformation I could feel was possible but couldn't yet name. It wasn't a voice in the conventional sense, no audible sound, but a deep magnetic pull towards the hidden currents of the Hermetic tradition, towards the whispers of knowledge that the published texts only hinted at, towards the edges of documented history where the most powerful teachings had been kept oral, initiatory, accessible only to those deemed ready. My journey began not with books, but with experiences I couldn't explain, moments when I felt an energy rising within me like fire, but not painful, ascending my spine in spirals, bringing with it visions of geometric patterns, of light condensing into form, of a great unity differentiating itself into multiplicity, yet never losing its essential oneness. These experiences terrified and fascinated me equally, and when I tried to research them, I found scattered references in texts on Kundalini, on alchemy, on Hermetic philosophy, but nothing that brought it all together, nothing that explained what I was experiencing and why. In recurring dreams, I walked through Egyptian temples that didn't exist in any ruins I could find. Temples where women in robes bearing the symbol of the uraeus, the cobra crown, taught groups of initiates about the path of return, about how the divine had descended into matter and how consciousness could ascend back to source through mastering what they called the dragon's fire. One woman in particular appeared again and again in these visions, a figure of such presence and power that I came to think of her as the Dragon Queen, though I didn't know if she was historical, archetypal, or somehow both. She would look at me with eyes that seemed to contain stars and say, "You already know the path. You have walked it before. You must remember, not learn. The monad calls its own back to itself through fire." These dreams left me shaking, weeping, desperate to understand. It was in a rare manuscript auction in London, where I had gone on impulse with money I didn't have, that I encountered the text that would consume my life. Among Greek magical papyri and medieval grimoires was a codex that the auctioneer described dismissively as probably 19th century occult fantasy. But the moment I saw it, I knew it was older, much older, and that I had to possess it regardless of cost. The bidding was fierce, but I persisted beyond all reason, and when I finally held it, I understood why. Its title, in faded gold leaf on dark leather, read, "The Testament of the Dragon Queens, the Hermetic Path of the Monad's Fire and the Sacred Union." The path unveiled by this extraordinary codex was not one of comfortable study, but a demanding initiatory process that required not just intellectual understanding, but complete transformation of consciousness, body, and energy. Each page I translated brought new challenges, new resistances, new terrors. The text described an order that had existed in Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, and perhaps far earlier, an order of women who were called dragon queens because they had mastered the serpent fire, the kundalini, the transformative energy that the Hermetic texts spoke of in veiled language as the secret fire, the philosophical Mercury, the dragon that must be tamed. These women understood what later Hermetic philosophers would encode in abstract symbols, that the universe emanated from the monad, the one, the unified source beyond all duality, and that this emanation occurred through a process of differentiation, spirit descending into matter, consciousness condensing into form. The great work, the opus magnum of alchemy, was the reverse process, matter becoming spirit, multiplicity returning to unity, the separated consciousness reuniting with the monad. But this was not metaphor or philosophy alone. It was practice, technique, actual transformation achieved through working with the dragon fire, the primal energy that, when awakened and directed with wisdom, could transmute every level of being. The Dragon Queens taught that this fire was especially accessible through the feminine, through the womb, as cauldron of transformation, through the energy channels that in women naturally spiraled like the double helix of the caduceus, like the DNA itself, like the dragon coiling around the tree of life. They taught specific practices, breathwork and movement and visualization, methods for awakening the fire safely, for directing it through the body's energy centers, for using it to burn away the dross of limited identity and reveal the gold of divine consciousness. And they taught that the final stage of the work was the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos, not between woman and man externally, but between the polarities within, the union of the awakened dragon fire with the descending light of the monad, the meeting of that which ascends from below with that which descends from above, creating in the initiate a living embodiment of the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, a being in whom heaven and earth were united, a walking temple of the monad's presence. The text was clear that this teaching had been suppressed, deliberately obscured, because a person who achieved this union was autonomous, needed no external religious authority, could not be controlled by hierarchies that claimed to mediate between humanity and the divine. The Dragon Queens had been powerful, threatening to patriarchal structures, and so their order had been destroyed, their teachings scattered, their very existence erased from history except in the encoded symbols that alchemists would copy for centuries without fully understanding their origin. The resistance I encountered as I began to practice what the Codex taught was overwhelming, both internal and external. Internally, every level of my conditioning rose up in protest. The rational mind insisted this was fantasy, that Kundalini awakening was dangerous without a living guru, that I was playing with forces I couldn't control. The religious conditioning I had absorbed from a Christian culture whispered that this was demonic, that the serpent was evil, that seeking to become divine was the original sin. The psychological defenses that protected my limited sense of self recognized that this path threatened to destroy the ego I had carefully constructed, and they fought with every weapon: doubt, fear, distraction, subtle sabotage of my practice. Physically, as the fire began to awaken, I experienced periods of intense discomfort, energies moving through my body in ways that felt overwhelming, heat and pressure, and sensations that no doctor could explain or treat. Externally, I faced skepticism and concern from friends who thought I was having a breakdown. I lost my academic position when my research into the Dragon Queens was deemed not serious scholarship. I encountered individuals, some claiming to be from esoteric orders, who warned me that I was accessing teachings I wasn't ready for, that the Dragon Queen's path was dangerous for someone without proper initiation. Yet there were also moments of confirmation, encounters that seemed orchestrated by forces beyond chance. An elderly Egyptian woman I met in a market in Cairo, who looked at me with startling recognition and said, "You carry the fire. I see it." My grandmother was taught by her grandmother that there had been women in the old times who walked with the dragon, who could heal and transform and see between the worlds. She said they would return when the time was right, when the world needed the balance they represented. Perhaps you are one of them, returned. A Jungian analyst who, when I described my experiences, didn't pathologize them but said, "What you're describing sounds like individuation at an accelerated, intensive level. The dragon in alchemy is the transformative force of the unconscious, the energy that dissolves old structures and creates new wholeness. If you're truly experiencing this, you're undergoing the process that the alchemists described in symbols, the transformation that leads to what they called the philosophical gold, what we might call the self, the integrated totality. These validations sustained me through the darkest periods of doubt and fear. The climax arrived on a night when I had been fasting and practicing intensively for 40 days, following a protocol the Codex outlined for those seeking the final initiation, the union with the monad. I was in the hidden chamber I had created, surrounded by the symbols and tools the Dragon Queens had used, having recited the invocations at the prescribed hours, having done the breathing and energy work until my body felt like it was made of light rather than matter. As midnight approached, I performed the final ritual, calling not to any external deity, but to the monad within and beyond, to the source of my own consciousness, to the one from which I had seemingly separated, but from which I had never truly been a part. And something broke open or through or awake, or the fire that had been building through weeks of practice suddenly surged with an intensity beyond anything I had experienced, racing up my spine like lightning, exploding through the crown of my head in a pillar of fire that connected earth and sky through my body. I was no longer Lyra in any conventional sense. I was consciousness itself, witnessing the dance of energy and form, seeing how the one becomes the many through a process of self-forgetting, and how the many return to the one through remembering. I experienced what the Hermetic texts called the monad, not as concept but as living reality, as the unified field from which all multiplicity springs, the consciousness that underlies and includes all apparently separate consciousnesses, the source that eternally emanates and eternally receives back into itself. I understood that I had never been separate from this monad, that the separation was illusion, created by identification with limited form, and that what the Dragon Queens had taught was the method for dissolving that illusion, for allowing consciousness to recognize its own unity while still functioning in the world of multiplicity. I saw the Dragon Queens themselves, not as dead historical figures, but as presences, as patterns of consciousness that existed in the collective field that could be accessed by those who walked their path. They spoke not in words, but in direct transmission of understanding, showing me that their teaching had never been lost, only hidden, that it lived in the symbols that alchemists had copied for centuries, in the myths of dragon slaying that actually encoded instructions for mastering the dragon fire, in the dreams of those whose souls remembered the path even when their conscious minds had forgotten. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. I understood why the path of the Dragon Queens had to be hidden and why it was emerging now. A humanity that knew the monad's fire, that could access divine union directly through practice rather than through intermediary priesthoods and institutions, that understood the dragon as sacred rather than as evil to be slain. Such a humanity could not be controlled by hierarchies claiming unique access to God. The Dragon Queens had represented a form of spiritual autonomy, especially for women, that patriarchal structures found intolerable. But the suppression had never been complete. The knowledge had survived in fragments, in symbols, in practices preserved by various esoteric traditions, waiting for a time when consciousness would be ready to integrate it again. That time was now, not because of any external cosmic plan, but because the crises facing humanity required exactly what this path offered. Direct experience of unity that dissolves the illusion of separation, transformation of consciousness that makes exploitation and violence impossible, connection to the source that brings meaning and purpose without need for external validation. When I finally returned to ordinary consciousness, hours or perhaps days had passed. I couldn't tell. I was lying on the floor of the chamber, my body still vibrating with energy, my mind expanded beyond any previous boundary. I had touched the monad. I had walked the path of the Dragon Queens, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was not unique, that others were remembering, that the teaching was emerging again because it had to, because the world needed it, because consciousness itself was ready for the next stage of the great work. The weeks that followed were of profound integration and silence. I could not immediately speak of what had occurred, could barely function in the ordinary world that now seemed like a theater, a play of forms within the unified consciousness I had experienced. I withdrew to a retreat center, spending my days in meditation and contemplation, allowing the experience to settle into every level of my being, learning how to embody the understanding while still functioning in the world of multiplicity. In that silence, I came to understand what my role was to be. I was not to keep the teaching secret, as the Dragon Queens had been forced to do in hostile times, but to make it accessible again, to translate the ancient practices for modern seekers, to help others remember what their souls already knew. I understood that the monad's fire could not be given or taught in the ordinary sense, but only awakened in those who were ready, but that creating the conditions for awakening, providing the maps and practices and community support, was itself sacred work. I began to write, first compiling and translating the codex of the Dragon Queens, adding commentary that explained the Hermetic philosophy underlying their practices, connecting their teaching to similar paths in other traditions while honoring what was unique about their approach. I created a comprehensive text I titled The Monad's Fire, the Dragon Queens, and the Hermetic Path to Divine Union. In it, I presented the philosophy that the universe emanates from the monad, the one, through a process of differentiation, and that the path of return exists, encoded in the serpent fire, accessible through practices that awaken and direct this transformative energy. I explained why this teaching had been suppressed, because it threatened every hierarchy built on the claim that God was distant and accessible only through proper authorities, because it especially empowered women, suggesting that the feminine held unique access to transformative power through the body's natural spiraling energies. I presented the practices themselves, adapted for modern practitioners, with careful warnings about the intensity and necessity of proper preparation. And most importantly, I conveyed the vision that humans could achieve divine union, could return to conscious awareness of their identity with the monad while maintaining individual function, could become living embodiments of the Hermetic truth that microcosm and macrocosm are one. My final act was to create a school, a modern instantiation of the Dragon Queen's order, open to all genders, but especially focused on reclaiming women's spiritual authority and the path of transformation through the feminine mysteries. We met in the hidden chamber beneath Alexandria, which through synchronicity and resources that appeared when needed, I had been able to lease and restore. There, beneath the ruins of the ancient temple, we practiced the methods of the Dragon Queens, awakening the fire, directing it through the body's energy centers, learning the art of transformation that turns the lead of limited consciousness into the gold of divine awareness. We studied the Hermetic texts with new eyes, seeing in them the practical instructions that the Dragon Queens had encoded. We honored the dragon not as enemy but as ally, not as evil but as sacred, understanding it as the force of transformation itself, the energy that dissolves old forms and creates new possibility. And we worked towards the sacred marriage, the union of the ascending fire with the descending light, the integration of the polarities that creates the philosopher's stone, the consciousness that has returned to the monad while maintaining individual awareness. On the anniversary of my own initiatory experience, I stood in that chamber with a circle of practitioners who had committed to the path, and I spoke aloud what I had come to know. The monad calls its own back to itself through fire. This is the secret the Dragon Queens preserved, the truth that every authentic spiritual path points toward, but that few articulate clearly. You are not separate from the divine source. You have never been separate. The separation is illusion, maintained by identification with limited form. The great work is the dissolving of that illusion, the awakening to your true nature as consciousness itself, the return to the monad that you never truly left. The dragon fire is the transformative force that makes this awakening possible, burning away the dross of false identity, revealing the gold of divine awareness that was always there. The path is not easy. It requires everything. It demands the death of who you thought you were, so that who you truly are can be revealed. But it is possible. The Dragon Queens proved it is possible. And we who walk their path now prove it again, not for our own sake alone, but for all beings, because every consciousness that awakens to its unity with the monad makes it easier for others to awaken, strengthens the field of remembrance, brings closer the time when humanity as a whole will remember what the ancients knew, that we are all expressions of the One, that the sacred marriage of heaven and earth occurs within each being, that the return to the monad is not just metaphor, but lived reality, not just philosophy, but direct experience, not just ancient wisdom, but present possibility. And as I spoke, I felt the presence of the Dragon Queens themselves. not as external entities, but as patterns within the collective consciousness, as the living teaching that could never die because it was encoded in consciousness itself, as the fire that burns through all ages, calling its own back home. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.